The night her husband changed the locks, Sarah Bennett did not scream. She stood on the freezing concrete of Oak Ridge's main street, her 3-year-old pressed against her chest, her older children shivering under a single torn blanket in a rusted station wagon. $23 in her pocket, 3 cardboard boxes in the trunk. 12 years of marriage reduced to an eviction notice taped to a brass lock she no longer had the key for. Richard was already across town, signing demolition papers, building his empire, standing beside the woman he had chosen instead. He had swept his family away like dust. Quickly, cleanly, without looking back. But in that haste, he left one thing behind, a scratched antique music box, dismissed as junk. Never opened. Inside its broken base lay a sealed envelope that would cost him everything. He had spent 12 years underestimating her. That was the last mistake he would ever make. Every evening at exactly 7 o'clock, 34-year-old Sarah Bennett sat at the scarred oak dining table in her Elm Street home, her black fountain pen scratching rhythmically against the pages of a leather-bound ledger. She meticulously cataloged the historical deeds and land boundaries of Oak Ridge for the local Heritage Society, a quiet hobby that brought structure to her busy days. Around her, the house hummed with the comforting warmth of a family routine. In the adjacent kitchen, the scent of fresh cinnamon tea drifted through the air, while 10-year-old Leo helped his 7-year-old sister Maya assemble a cardboard castle on the living room rug. 3-year-old Toby napped upstairs, his soft breathing carrying through the baby monitor. Sarah loved this house, with its creaking pine floors and hand-carved crown molding, built decades ago by Richard's grandfather, Arthur. Before Arthur passed away, Sarah spent her Sunday afternoons sitting in his study, helping him organize decades of real estate archives. Arthur always noted that Sarah possessed a rare photographic memory for legal descriptions. She could glance at an archaic land survey from 1890 and instantly spot a missing easement or a mismatched boundary marker, navigating complex legal jargon with the ease of someone reading a favorite novel. She never bragged about this skill. She simply kept the mental maps tucked away, a quiet filing cabinet in her mind. But the quiet harmony of Sarah's world began to fray in late September. It started when Richard, her husband of 12 years, stopped showing up for their family dinners. One Thursday evening, the grandfather clock in the hallway struck midnight, then 1, and finally 2. When the front door finally clicked open, Richard slipped inside, smelling of expensive cedarwood cologne and premium single malt whiskey, scents he never wore. Sarah stood up from the dark kitchen table, holding a mug of cold tea. As she reached to take his wet trench coat, a slip of paper fluttered out of the pocket and landed on the hardwood floor. It was a receipt from a high-end jewelry boutique on Grand Avenue, $28,000 for a platinum diamond tennis bracelet. Sarah picked up the paper, her thumb brushing over the expensive cardstock. Richard violently snatched the receipt from her hand, crumpling it into his pocket before she could speak. He walked past her without a word, locking his office door behind him with a sharp click. Sarah stood alone in the dark hallway, her fingers trembling slightly. She looked down at her bare wrist, which held only a simple silver band Arthur had given her for her wedding. She shook her head, forcing herself to believe that the luxury item was merely a corporate gift for a major investor in Richard's new development project. She returned to the dining table, picked up her fountain pen, and resumed writing, burying her rising unease beneath the steady, comforting rhythm of her ink strokes. On the morning of October 12th, a cold, gray rain lashed against the dining room windows. Sarah sat at her ledger, but her hand remained still. On the table lay a heavy manila envelope that had been delivered by a private courier 20 minutes earlier. Inside was a certified copy of a quitclaim deed for their Elm Street home, dated 6 months prior, bearing her husband's bold signature and a crude, shaky imitation of her own hand at the bottom. Accompanying the deed was a formal divorce petition and a 3-day notice to vacate the premises, signed by a county sheriff's deputy. Sarah traced the ink of her forged signature. She did not cry. Instead, she picked up her car keys, grabbed the manila envelope, and walked out to her station wagon. She drove straight to the towering glass facade of Bennett Development on Grand Avenue. Pushing past the receptionist, Sarah marched into Richard's top-floor office. Richard sat behind a polished mahogany desk, typing on his laptop while his administrative assistant, a young woman named Evelyn, poured coffee from a silver carafe. Sarah threw the forged quitclaim deed onto the desk, the paper sliding across the smooth wood until it hit Richard's keyboard. Richard did not look up immediately. He slowly closed his laptop, picked up a gold fountain pen, and slid a secondary document across the desk toward her. It was a court-sanctioned emergency eviction order, signed by Judge Thomas, a man who regularly shared a golf cart with Richard on Sunday mornings. The document cited Sarah's complete lack of independent income and volatile behavioral tendencies as grounds for her immediate removal from the property, granting Richard sole temporary occupancy. "You signed my name, Richard," Sarah said, her voice steady, though her fingers gripped the edge of his desk until her knuckles turned white. "You stole my grandfather's house." Richard adjusted his silk tie, his expression as flat as a ledger page. "Arthur left the real estate firm to me, Sarah. The house is corporate property. I've already sold it to clear the municipal debts for the Grand Oak project. Blackwood and Associates is representing me. If you aren't out by Friday at 5 o'clock, the sheriff will remove you." He waved a hand toward Evelyn, who stepped forward and opened the office door, waiting in silence. By Friday afternoon, the rain had turned to sleet. Sarah stood on the sidewalk of Elm Street, watching a private security guard click a heavy padlock chain around the wrought iron gates of her home. Her belongings, 3 cardboard boxes of children's clothes, a bin of old toys, and a few family photo albums were stacked on the wet pavement. Beside them sat a rusted station wagon, its exhaust pipe coughing gray smoke into the freezing air. The locksmith packed his tools into a van and drove away without looking at her. Sarah packed the boxes into the trunk, buckled 3-year-old Toby into his car seat, and drove toward the only place she could afford, a cramped, drafty 2-room rental above an auto repair shop on the industrial edge of Oak Ridge. 2 weeks later, the temperature inside the rental dropped to 41 degrees. Sarah sat on the floor of the small kitchen, counting the bills on the countertop. She had exactly $23 left, a half-used book of stamps, and a shut-off notice from the gas company. In the corner of the room sat a single item she had retrieved from the attic before the gates were locked, a heavy dust-covered Swiss music box made of dark burl walnut, decorated with tarnished brass inlay. It was the only item Richard had left behind, dismissing it as worthless family junk. Desperate to buy a tank of heating oil and a gallon of milk, Sarah decided to take the music box to the local antique shop down the street. She lifted the heavy wooden box, cradling it in her arms as she moved toward the steep, uncarpeted wooden stairs of the rental. "Mom, let me help," 10-year-old Leo said, running out of the bedroom to grab the corner of the box. "I've got it, sweetheart. Just stay back," Sarah warned, her boots slipping slightly on the slick linoleum near the doorway. Leo reached out anyway, his foot catching on a frayed loose seam of the linoleum. He stumbled forward, colliding with Sarah's shoulder. The heavy music box slipped from her grip. It tumbled down the wooden staircase, bouncing violently off the sharp steps before crashing into the concrete landing at the bottom. Sarah rushed down the stairs, her heart hammering against her ribs as she knelt beside the shattered relic. The polished walnut lid had snapped off, and the delicate brass gears inside lay bent and silent. But as she lifted the broken frame, she noticed the false velvet floor of the box had splintered completely open. Tucked into the hollowed-out wooden base beneath the gears was a thick, yellowed parchment envelope sealed with red wax and a small, tarnished brass key. The wax seal bore the distinctive family crest of Richard's late grandfather, Arthur Bennett. Sarah sat on the cold concrete of the staircase landing, the shattered pieces of the Swiss music box scattered around her boots. Leo stood 3 steps up, his small hands gripping the wooden railing, his chest rising and falling in rapid, silent breaths. Sarah did not look up at him. She reached into the splintered cavity of the walnut base, her fingers brushing past the cold brass gears to pull out the heavy, wax-sealed envelope. The red wax, stamped with Arthur Bennett's circular seal depicting an oak leaf, was cracked, but intact. Beside it lay the small brass key, its surface dulled by decades of tarnish. Sarah broke the wax seal. Inside lay 2 documents and a handwritten letter. She unfolded the first document, her eyes scanning the dense legal script. It was a certified bank registry slip from the Oak Ridge National Bank, dated September 14, 1998, detailing a restricted trust account under the name the Sarah Bennett Preservation Trust. The balance, printed in faded blue ink, read exactly $250,000. The second document was a copy of an unrecorded master deed for the Grand Oak Hotel, bearing a highly specific spike clause written in Arthur's precise architectural hand. The clause stated that if Richard Bennett ever abandoned his marital vows or committed document fraud against his family, the entire title of the Grand Oak Hotel and its surrounding 3 acres of commercial land would immediately and solely revert to Sarah Bennett and her children. The accompanying letter was addressed directly to her, Sarah, my child. If you are reading this, Richard has done exactly what I feared he would. He has inherited his father's hollow greed, but none of his honor. He believes he has swept you aside, but he does not know that this firm was built on the land my father gave me, not his. This key opens safe deposit box number 412 at the Oak Ridge National Bank. Inside is the original, signed master deed and the evidence of the forgery Richard's father used to take the company 40 years ago. Take it, rebuild. Do not let him tear down our history. Sarah folded the papers and tucked them into the deep inner pocket of her canvas coat. She stood up, brushed the sawdust from her knees, and looked up at Leo. She did not smile, but she reached out and squeezed his shoulder. Go get your sister and Toby, she said, her voice dropping to a calm, steady register. We have work to do. The next morning, the temperature inside the 2-room rental dropped to 38 degrees. The radiator let out a single metallic hiss and went completely cold. Sarah did not wait for the landlord to ignore another phone call. She dressed Maya and Toby in 3 layers of sweaters, packed a small backpack with bread and peanut butter, and walked down the steep stairs to the street. Her first destination was the Oak Ridge National Bank, a gray granite building with towering columns that sat directly across the square from Richard's corporate headquarters. Sarah walked through the heavy brass doors, carrying Toby on her hip, while Leo and Maya followed close behind, holding hands. She walked straight to the customer service counter, where a young teller named Brenda sat typing. Sarah placed the tarnished brass key and the yellowed bank registry slip on the polished black counter. I need to access safe deposit box 412, please. Brenda glanced at the slip, then at Sarah's worn canvas coat and her children's faded mittens. She tapped her computer keyboard twice, then frowned. This account has been inactive for over 15 years, Mrs. Bennett. Under the current municipal banking regulations, inactive corporate-related trusts associated with the Bennett firm require a secondary signature from the active corporate president, Richard Bennett. This is a private trust, not a corporate asset, Sarah said. She reached into her pocket and pulled out Arthur's letter, pointing to the specific notary stamp on the back of the registry slip. The original depositor was Arthur Bennett. I am the sole trustee. The secondary signature requirement only applies to commercial operating lines, not personal preservation trusts. Brenda hesitated, her hand hovering over the telephone. I'll have to call the branch manager, Mr. Henderson. 10 minutes later, Mr. Henderson, a man with thinning hair and a gold watch that glinted under the fluorescent lights, stepped out of his glass office. He did not look at the documents. Instead, he looked at Sarah's boots, which were still stained with the salt and slush from the street. Mrs. Bennett, I'm familiar with your situation, Henderson said, his voice carrying a condescending warmth. But Richard Bennett's legal counsel, Blackwood and Associates, filed a formal asset freeze notification with this branch 3 days ago, citing pending divorce litigation and disputed marital property. Until that litigation is resolved, I cannot allow any access to boxes or accounts associated with the Bennett name. Sarah stepped closer to the counter, her voice dropping so only Henderson could hear. This safe deposit box was registered in 1998, 7 years before I married Richard. It is listed under my maiden name, Sarah Jenkins, as the primary beneficiary, with Arthur Bennett as the grantor. If you refuse to allow me access to my personal premarital property without a federal court order, I will file a formal complaint with the State Banking Commissioner by 12 o'clock today. I have the notary receipts right here. Henderson's smile faded. He looked at the yellowed slip, then at the tarnished brass key. He slowly reached into his pocket, pulled out a master key, and gestured toward the heavy steel door of the vault. Follow me, please. Inside the cool, quiet vault, Henderson inserted his key into box 412, and Sarah inserted her tarnished brass key. With a heavy, metallic click, the narrow steel drawer slid open. Inside lay a thick blue leather portfolio, a notarized copy of the 1956 partnership agreement between Arthur Bennett and his brother, and a sealed black USB drive. Sarah lifted the portfolio, placing it securely inside her canvas bag. She did not open it in front of Henderson. She took her children's hands and walked out of the bank. But her victory was short-lived. To fight Richard's legal team, she needed more than documents. She needed a place to organize her defense, and she needed a phone line and a typewriter. She walked down the alleyway behind the main street, heading toward the rear entrance of the Oak Ridge Historical Archive. The archive was housed in the basement of the old municipal library, a drafty, damp space filled with rows of metal shelving and cardboard boxes of old newspapers. The archivist, Clara Montgomery, was a 72-year-old woman with sharp blue eyes and a permanent scowl. She sat behind a metal desk, sorting through old photographs with a magnifying glass. Clara had spent 40 years working for the town, and she had known Arthur Bennett since they were children. I heard what that boy of yours did, Clara said without looking up as Sarah entered, shedding his family like an old coat, just like his father, Julian. Julian would have sold his own mother's gravestone if the price of granite went up. I need a place to work, Clara, Sarah said, setting her bag on the edge of the desk. And I need access to the land registry files from 1956 to 1962. Clara looked up, her gaze shifting from Sarah's tired face to the three children sitting quietly on a stack of folded wool blankets in the corner. She slid a key across the desk, the key to the back door. There's an old desk in the corner behind the microfiche machines. The heater works if you kick the pipe twice. And there's a kettle in the back. Don't let the library trustees see those kids, or they'll cite me for a building code violation. For the next 3 weeks, Sarah's routine became a battle of endurance. Every morning at 6, she walked her children to the library basement. While Leo helped Maya with her reading lessons and Toby played with a box of old wooden blocks, Sarah worked at the metal desk. She used Arthur's brass key to unlock the files in the blue portfolio. The portfolio contained the original, unrecorded partnership agreement between Arthur and his brother Thomas. It revealed that the land on which the Grand Oak Hotel sat had never belonged to the Bennett Corporation. It had been held in a private land trust that required any transfer of ownership to be signed by both brothers and their heirs. Richard's father, Julian, had forged Thomas's signature on the 1960 transfer deed, a forgery that Richard had carried forward into his current development plans. Sarah began cataloging every property transaction Richard's firm had completed over the last decade. She spent 12 hours a day cross-referencing parcel numbers, tax maps, and corporate filings. Her fingers became stained with black ink, and her eyes burned under the flickering fluorescent light. As she worked, the local business community, eager to stay in Richard's good graces for the upcoming development contracts, began to turn their backs on her. When she walked to the local grocery store to buy bread and eggs with her meager savings, the shopkeeper, Harold, refused to look her in the eye. "I can't extend your tab anymore, Sarah," Harold said, sliding her grocery bag across the counter. "Richard's office handles the delivery contracts for my wholesale goods. If he sees your name on my ledger, he'll cancel my lease." Sarah did not argue. She counted out $11.50 in quarters and dimes, pushed the coins across the counter, and carried her groceries back to the cold library basement. By mid-November, Richard's patience had run out. He discovered that Sarah had been digging through the historical archives and had accessed Arthur's safe deposit box. He decided to crush her completely. On a freezing Tuesday afternoon, as Sarah was typing a formal petition to the state licensing board, the basement door flew open. Richard stepped into the damp room, flanked by 2 men in dark suits from Blackwood and Associates and a city building inspector named Vance. Richard did not look at his children, who shrank back behind the metal shelving. He walked straight to Sarah's desk and threw a laminated document onto her paperwork. "This building has been flagged for immediate structural violations," Richard said, his voice cold and flat. "The city inspector has condemned the basement archive due to toxic mold and faulty wiring. You have 20 minutes to vacate the premises." And this, he tossed a secondary legal notice next to the first, is a formal lawsuit for the theft of corporate property. You took a Swiss music box and bank records that belong to Bennett Development. If you don't return them by 5 o'clock today, the sheriff will arrest you for grand theft. The building inspector, Vance, stepped forward with a roll of yellow caution tape. "You need to get the kids out of here, Mrs. Bennett. I'm locking the doors." Sarah stood up, her chair scraping loudly against the concrete floor. She did not flinch. She picked up her canvas bag, carefully packing her ledger, the blue portfolio, and the brass key. She looked Richard directly in the eye, her expression entirely devoid of fear. "You think you've closed every door, Richard," she said softly. "But you forgot that your grandfather built this town's foundation. and foundations don't wash away in the rain. She walked past him, guiding her 3 children up the stairs and out into the freezing wind. They had no home, no office, and no heat. But Sarah had one resource left, the secret trust account. She walked straight to the office of the state banking commissioner, located in the county courthouse 3 blocks away. She presented the original notarized trust documents and the blue leather portfolio to the commissioner, a stern, analytical woman named Evelyn Vance, no relation to Richard's mistress. For 3 hours, the commissioner reviewed the documents, comparing the signatures on the 1960 deed with the certified signatures in Arthur's safe deposit box. By the end of the meeting, the commissioner's face had gone pale. "This isn't just a civil dispute, Mrs. Bennett," the commissioner said, looking up from the papers. "This is a systemic multi-million-dollar corporate fraud. The transfer signatures on the Grand Oak property are clear, documented forgeries. I'm contacting the state attorney general's office immediately. The stage was set for the ultimate reversal." The next morning, November 21st, Richard hosted a massive televised press conference at the Oak Ridge City Hall. The room was packed with local journalists, business owners, and city council members. A giant architectural model of the Bennett luxury towers stood in the center of the stage, flanked by large banners showing glossy renderings of high-end condominiums that would replace Sarah's old neighborhood. Richard stood at the podium, dressed in a custom-tailored gray suit, a glass of champagne in his hand. Beside him stood his mistress, Evelyn, wearing the platinum diamond tennis bracelet Richard had bought with their joint savings. Today, we begin a new chapter for Oak Ridge, Richard announced into the microphones, his voice booming through the PA system. By demolishing the outdated, decaying structures of the old ward, we will bring jobs, wealth, and modern luxury to our community. The Grand Oak Hotel will be the crown jewel of this development. Just as Richard raised his glass to toast the city council, the heavy oak doors at the back of the hall swung open. Sarah walked into the room. She was accompanied by the county sheriff, Thomas Miller, and the state banking commissioner. She did not wear expensive clothes. She wore her faded canvas coat and her boots, but she held her head high, carrying the blue leather portfolio in her hands. The room fell dead silent. The television cameras instantly swung away from the stage to focus on her. Richard Bennett, Sheriff Miller's voice echoed through the hall as he stepped onto the stage, pulling a pair of steel handcuffs from his utility belt. "I have a warrant for your immediate arrest on charges of grand larceny, commercial document forgery, and systemic asset concealment." Richard's face drained of color. He dropped his champagne glass, the crystal shattering on the polished wooden stage. "This is a mistake. My wife is unstable. She has no authority, actually, Mr. Bennett, she does," the state banking commissioner announced, stepping to the microphone. "The state has verified that the transfer deeds for the Grand Oak property were forged by your father and carried forward by your office. All assets of Bennett Development have been frozen by order of the state Supreme Court, and the development rights of this entire tract have been transferred to the rightful trustee, Sarah Bennett. Evelyn gasped, stepping away from Richard as 2 deputies stepped onto the stage, grabbed Richard's arms and pulled them behind his back. The steel handcuffs clicked shut with a sharp final sound. The crowd of business owners and journalists erupted into a frenzy of shouting and camera flashes. Richard was led out of the hall in handcuffs, his expensive suit rumpled, his eyes darting wildly as he passed Sarah. Sarah stood perfectly still, watching him go. She did not say a word. She simply reached into her pocket, felt the cold brass key of the music box, and knew that the long, freezing road of trials had finally brought her back to the start. The heavy iron gates of the Elm Street home remained locked, But Sarah no longer looked at them when she walked by. Instead, her focus shifted entirely to the corner of Broad and Market Streets, where the Grand Oak Hotel stood like a sleeping giant beneath layers of soot and scaffolding. With the $250,000 from Arthur's Preservation Trust officially unfrozen by the State Bank Commissioner, Sarah did not buy a new car or rent a luxury apartment. She wore the same patched canvas coat, but she carried a leather contractor's clipboard. By 6:30 every morning, she was on site, supervising a crew of 16 local carpenters and masons, men who had been laid off when Richard's development firm halted operations. Sarah spent her days in the belly of the hotel. She did not stand back and give orders. She climbed the wooden scaffolding, her hands covered in white drywall dust and gray plaster. She used a wire brush to personally strip the layers of cheap latex paint Richard's crew had sloppily rolled over the original mahogany wall panels in the lobby. Beneath the dirty latex, the rich, dark grain of the wood gleamed once more under the work lights. She kept her ledger open on a makeshift desk constructed from 2 sawn-off barrels and a sheet of plywood. Every evening, she accounted for every penny spent: $4,200 for copper plumbing valves, $1,150 for structural timber to reinforce the ballroom joists, and $320 for local coal to keep the drying plaster from freezing in the bitter November air. As the weeks passed, a quiet shift rippled through the town of Oak Ridge. The silence of suspicion began to thaw into curiosity, then into action. It started with Harold, the grocer who had once refused her credit. One chilly morning, a flatbed truck pulled up to the hotel's service entrance. Harold climbed down from the cabin, his hands tucked into his apron pockets. Behind him, the truck bed was loaded with 3 antique oak dressers and a pair of hand-carved high-back chairs. Dot found these in the basement of the old municipal hall, Sarah, Harold said, clearing his throat and looking down at his boots. They belonged to the original hotel lobby back in 1920. Arthur bought them at an auction 30 years ago. I thought, well, they belong here, not gathering dust in the dark. He did not ask for money. He simply helped her crew unload the heavy furniture, his face red from the cold and a quiet sense of pride. By the end of November, more townspeople arrived. Clara Montgomery, the archivist, spent her Saturdays cataloging the historical photographs of the hotel's original interior, helping Sarah's design crew match the exact paint colors of the Victorian era. Local women brought hot pots of beef stew and fresh bread to the construction site, keeping the workers warm as the winter winds began to howl through the valley. The neighborhood that Richard had planned to flatten was coming alive, its residents finding work and purpose in the shadow of the rising hotel. The unrecorded master deed, once a hidden secret in a broken music box, was now transforming into a physical anchor for the entire community. Yet, the shadow of Richard's influence still lingered, a cold draft that threatened to snuff out the warmth Sarah had built. From his cell at the county correctional facility, Richard was not quiet. His defense team, Blackwood and Associates, launched a vicious, desperate legal counter-offensive. On a Tuesday afternoon, as Sarah was inspecting the newly installed brass chandeliers in the main dining room, a young courier in a sharp black suit walked into the lobby. He handed Sarah a thick envelope bound with a red litigation ribbon. It was a formal motion for an emergency injunction filed in the county superior court. Richard's lawyers claimed that the spite clause in Arthur's deed was an illegal restraint on alienation and a violation of public policy. They argued that because the deed had never been officially recorded at the county courthouse before Arthur's death, the property technically remained an asset of the bankrupt Bennett Development Corporation, subject to liquidation to pay off Richard's commercial creditors, that if the injunction was granted, all work on the Grand Oak Hotel would be forced to stop immediately. The bank would refreeze the remaining trust funds, the workers would be laid off just weeks before Christmas, and the historic building would be sold to a corporate liquidator from the state capitol. Sarah sat down on the bottom step of the grand lobby staircase. She did not let her hands shake. She stared at the red ribbon on the legal document for 5 long minutes. The lobby was quiet, save for the rhythmic drip of condensation from a radiator pipe. She realized that Richard was attempting to use the very bureaucracy Arthur had despised to strangle the family's legacy. She stood up, walked to her plywood desk, and opened the blue leather portfolio. She spent the entire night under the glare of a single halogen work light, cross-referencing the county's historical charter with the corporate bylaws of Bennett Development from 1962. By sunrise, her eyes were bloodshot, but her desk was covered in yellowed municipal tax maps and old corporate tax receipts. She had found the missing link. When Julian Bennett, Richard's father, had forged the land transfer signature in 1960, he had also filed a fraudulent tax exemption status for the hotel property, claiming it was a non-profit civic center to avoid paying municipal land taxes. For over 40 years, the Bennett Corporation had avoided paying millions of dollars in local taxes on the land. Sarah did not call a lawyer. She walked straight to the county courthouse and requested an emergency hearing before Judge Vance, the presiding administrative judge. At 2:00 that afternoon, Sarah stood at the petitioner's podium in a wood-paneled courtroom. Across the aisle sat 3 lawyers from Blackwood and Associates, their briefcases filled with polished legal briefs. Your Honor, the lead attorney, a man named Henderson, argued, his voice smooth and confident. The unrecorded deed is a legal ghost. It cannot supersede the established corporate assets of Bennett Development, which are currently earmarked for creditor restitution. To allow the respondent to proceed with the opening of this hotel is a violation of basic commercial law. Judge Vance looked over her spectacles at Sarah. Mrs. Bennett, what is your response? Sarah stood tall, her voice calm and clear. She did not read from a script. She spoke from her precise photographic memory of the records. The unrecorded deed is not a ghost, Your Honor. It is a conditional trust agreement. Under Section 12 of the Oak Ridge Municipal Charter of 1955, any property that is found to have been subject to systematic tax evasion by a corporate entity immediately reverts to the county's historical trust, unless the outstanding liabilities are paid in full by a qualified heir. She stepped forward and placed a certified cashier's check for $84,000 on the clerk's desk. This check covers the entirety of the back taxes owed on the Grand Oak property from 1960 to the present day, calculated using the original land values, Sarah explained. As the designated trustee of Arthur Bennett's Preservation Fund, I have exercised the right of redemption. Under municipal law, this redemption solidifies the transfer of the master deed, rendering any corporate claims by Bennett Development or its creditors completely null and void. The lead attorney from Blackwood and Associates scrambled through his files, his face turning a deep, embarrassed red as he realized Sarah had used a 60-year-old municipal tax loophole to completely bypass their corporate arguments. Judge Vance reviewed the municipal charter, then looked down at the certified check. She picked up her gavel and struck the wooden block with a sharp, echoing crack. The motion for an injunction is denied, Judge Vance ruled. The redemption is valid. The title of the Grand Oak Hotel remains solely and indisputably with Sarah Bennett and her heirs. Court is adjourned. The lawyers packed their briefcases in furious silence and hurried out the back door. Sarah walked out of the courthouse and into the bright winter afternoon. The air was cold, but the sun was shining, reflecting off the clean, polished glass windows of the Grand Oak Hotel across the street. The community was waiting for her on the sidewalk, their faces filled with anticipation. The stage was set. The final confrontation was only days away. The morning of December 15th arrived with a crisp, clear sky that reflected off the newly polished brass fixtures of the Grand Oak Hotel. At 8 o'clock, the grand lobby was silent, filled only with the warm, golden light filtering through the restored stained glass transom windows. On the mahogany wall directly behind the reception desk, mounted inside a heavy shadow box of museum-grade glass, sat the shattered pieces of the dark burl walnut Swiss music box. Next to the broken wood lay the original, handwritten master deed, its red wax seal depicting the oak leaf preserved perfectly under the glass. It was no longer a secret buried in a dark attic. It was the official, legal foundation of the entire property. Sarah Bennett stood behind the front desk, her fingers smoothing down the lapel of her tailored navy blazer. She adjusted the brass name tag pinned to her chest, Sarah Bennett, proprietor. Beside her stood Leo, Maya, and Toby, all dressed in their neat dark blue school uniforms. Outside, a crowd of over 200 Oak Ridge residents had already gathered on the sidewalk, their breath forming white clouds in the winter air as they waited for the ceremonial ribbon cutting. The heavy glass front doors chimed as they were pushed open, but it was not an eager customer who stepped inside. Richard Bennett walked into the lobby, his boots squeaking against the wet, polished marble floor. He did not wear his custom-tailored gray suit or his gold watch. Out on bail, pending his formal sentencing for corporate fraud and grand larceny, his hair was unkempt, and his thin, off-the-rack trench coat was damp from the melting snow. His eyes darted from the glittering crystal chandeliers to the rich mahogany paneling, finally landing on the framed shadow box behind the desk. He stopped 10 feet from the counter, his hands shoved deep into his coat pockets. "Sarah," he said, his voice carrying a dry, raspy edge. He took 2 steps forward, his boots leaving muddy gray tracks on the pristine floor. "We need to talk. Privately. Before you open those doors," Sarah did not step back. She placed her hands flat on the polished mahogany counter, looking at him with a calm, unblinking gaze. "There is nothing private left between us." Richard let out a harsh, dry laugh, though his eyes remained desperate. He leaned against the edge of the desk, pointing a trembling finger at the shadow box. "You think you've won because of some dusty old paper my grandfather hid in a toy? You've ruined the Bennett name. You've frozen the corporate accounts. My lawyers say if we settle this now, if you sign a joint management agreement for the hotel, I can get the criminal charges reduced. We can still run this place together." For the kids, he reached across the counter, his hand extending toward hers. "Think about the family, Sarah. You can't run a multi-million-dollar hospitality operation on your own. You're an archivist. You don't know anything about corporate debt structures or municipal zoning." Sarah looked down at his outstretched hand, then back up to his face. She did not raise her voice. She did not display anger or tears. She simply picked up a thick, bound leather ledger from the desk and slid it toward him. "This is the active operating ledger for the Grand Oak Hotel, Richard," she said, her voice echoing clearly in the quiet lobby. "As of 8 o'clock this morning, we have 92% occupancy booked through the spring. Every local vendor you threatened has been signed to a 5-year service contract with a 20% premium. The municipal zoning department finalized our historic preservation status yesterday afternoon. I did all of this without a single corporate loan and without forging a single signature. Richard's hand slowly dropped back to his side. His mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. You didn't lose this hotel because of a dusty paper, Richard, Sarah continued, her voice steady and absolute. You lost it because you believe that people, like buildings, can be demolished and replaced when they are no longer convenient to you. But my grandfather Arthur knew that a structure is only as strong as its foundation. You tore down our home, but you left the foundation intact. From the street outside, a sharp double beep of a horn broke the silence. A white city maintenance truck pulled up to the curb directly in front of the hotel's towering glass entrance. A county deputy in a brown uniform stepped out of the driver's side, holding a clipboard and a bright orange, high-visibility mesh vest. Richard Bennett. The deputy called out through the open glass doors, his voice booming into the lobby. Your community service shift started 5 minutes ago. Let's go. You've got 3 blocks of sidewalk to sweep before the parade starts. Richard turned his head, staring through the glass at the orange vest dangling from the deputy's hand. His shoulders slumped, the last remnants of his corporate posture vanishing. He looked back at Sarah, his face hollow, his eyes pleading for some sign of hesitation or compromise. Sarah met his gaze. There was no malice in her eyes, no desire for revenge. There was only the cold, unyielding reality of her choice. She chose powerful, absolute rejection. She did not say goodbye. She gently reached down, picked up the heavy brass keyring from the desk, and handed it to Leo. She walked around the counter, guiding her 3 children toward the heavy front doors. Richard slowly turned and walked out of the lobby, his head bowed against the wind. The deputy handed him the orange vest and a long-handled wire street broom. Richard pulled the stiff, bright orange fabric over his thin coat, his hands shaking as he gripped the wooden handle of the broom. He stepped onto the curb and began to sweep the slush and dirt into the metal gutter, his face burning with public humiliation as the gathering crowd of townspeople turned to watch him. Sarah stood just inside the towering glass doors. She looked at her children, who stood tall beside her, their faces bright with security and pride. She reached out, grasped the polished brass close sign hanging on the inside of the glass, and gently flipped it to open. Every evening at exactly 7 o'clock, the soft amber light of the private family suite on the top floor of the Grand Oak Hotel illuminated the familiar scarred oak dining table, which Sarah had carefully salvaged from her old home. Sarah Bennett sat in a comfortable mahogany chair, the rhythmic, steady scratch of her black fountain pen echoing softly against the thick, cream-colored pages of a new leather-bound ledger. Outside the wide, arched windows, the streetlights of Oak Ridge flickered to life, casting a warm, peaceful glow over the quiet, snow-dusted streets below. In the adjacent living area, the comforting hum of her family's earned routine filled the warm air. The sweet, spicy scent of fresh cinnamon tea drifted from a hand-painted ceramic teapot resting on the sideboard. 10-year-old Leo sat on the plush wool rug, carefully constructing a miniature tower out of polished cedar blocks, his hands steady and focused. Beside him, 7-year-old Maya turned the pages of a library book, reading a story aloud in a quiet, rhythmic whisper. On the sofa, 3-year-old Toby slept soundly under a thick, hand-knitted green wool blanket, his chest rising and falling in a slow, peaceful rhythm. Sarah paused her writing, letting the fountain pen rest gently against her fingers. She looked down at her left hand. The simple silver band Arthur had given her years ago remained, but now, resting beside it on her wrist, was a delicate gold chain holding the small, tarnished brass key of the Swiss music box. It was a quiet reminder of the storm they had weathered. There were no more freezing rooms, no more utility shut-off notices, and no more frantic calculations of quarters and dimes on cold concrete stairs. The ledger before her did not catalog forged deeds or legal battles. It recorded the names of travelers, local families, and old friends who walked through the heavy glass doors of the Grand Oak to find comfort and community. She looked out the window down to the street corner below. The sidewalk was clean, cleared of the winter slush and autumn leaves. The orange-clad figure who had spent the afternoon sweeping the gutters was gone, his court-ordered shift completed, leaving only the quiet, lamplit pavement. Sarah let out a slow, quiet breath, feeling the deep, physical warmth of the room surround her. She picked up her pen, aligned her fingers with the familiar grip, and returned to her writing. The foundation was solid, the rooms were warm, and the story was finally hers to write.